for those just tuning in, this is the Tonic Accord podcast. Alex and I are both, political junkies, as well as work in various fields regarding politics. And we're going to be taking a look at what's going on, in Israel and Gaza, in Palestine and Israel, how these two nations are fighting each other, how they've been at odds, what's going on, and as well as we want to dive into kind of the coverage around it and how that might play a role in what we're seeing being reported. So, yeah, it's obviously a really sensitive topic, right? It's not an easy one to talk about. I think off the bat, we're not going to claim to know the answers or to have we don't claim to know what the solution to this is. That's not really what I want. I'm personally not going to try and solve this problem today, but there are important things to talk about and important things to remember when you're looking at a complex issue like this. And that's what we want to dive into, and we want to give some nuance to maybe something that doesn't have a lot of nuance online. So, before you start typing 15 messages really quick right now calling me whatever slant, just keep that in mind, that like this is a super complex problem, that not everything you see or hear might be 100% accurate, and that we really want to just do our best to get a good picture of what's going on so that we can find a real solution. With that in mind, Alex, how are you doing, man? And yeah, give us a little update on what is going on over in the Middle East.
Good to hear from you, Drew. Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's been kind of a hectic doozy of a week, but staying sane. Pretty excited for summer. Looks like it's going to be a good summer, so that's all I can ask for. And unless we get abducted by those UAPs or whatever they are, so.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. This is a complicated subject, and just to kind of add a little caveat to what you said is we both had a professor at Chapman back in the day, and I took a few Middle East classes with him, and he was an expert. Like this was kind of his topic was Israel and Palestine. And even after all of his experience, he still, couldn't come up with a solution. So it's a really complicated issue. And, specifically in this case, I just want to start with the background of this specific one, because this is the worst violence since 2014.
Right.
It's pretty bad that it's only been 7 years since the last time there was this bad of violence. But basically, it seems like there was like kind of a perfect storm scenario that happened here, where Ramadan, for people who don't know, doesn't fall on a date like, say, Independence Day or Christmas or whatever. Ramadan kind of changes every year. And because I've been in Morocco when it was on June something, or it's the month of June. But this time it was in April, which coincided, unfortunately, with the Israeli independence, like kind of national holiday. So you had two opposing groups that are sharing a very small piece of land who had a big holiday during the same period of time. And from what I've gathered, there was a mosque, which is a super famous mosque in Israel called the Aqsa Mosque, and the Arab Israelis were celebrating Ramadan there. Not celebrating, they had their religious things going on. And what happened is the Israeli authorities under the president, who is different than Netanyahu, he basically ordered to send authorities there to unplug the speakers from the mosque to quiet it down, because there was, Israeli celebrations going on, Jewish celebrations going on at the same time. And that started things, and it led to rock throwing, riots, and some clashing. But then at the same time, there were police raids throughout the city and other mosques. And then the court inside of Israel was reviewing a judgment to evict Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And then, at the same time, Muhammad Abbas, the kind of leader of Palestine, though he's not really the leader, and we'll get to that later, but he basically postponed elections, and he's really unpopular. I've heard people jokingly say that he's still in the 17th year of his first 4-year term. So he's an autocrat, a really bad autocrat, who really hasn't done much for the Israeli people. And he postponed elections, and I would just say kind of this whole culmination of events led to Israel kind of coming down with an iron fist. And I just off the bat want to just say, and then I'll turn it over to you, is that I do think Israel has acted too violent against the Palestinians, but it's way more complicated than that. But I do think Israel needs to be called out by the U.S. specifically, because the U.S. is one that they might actually listen to. But I do think the Palestinians also deserve some condemnation as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. So there is those spark ups, right? Is the issue with the mosque and the Ramadan celebration. Um, you know, like that that the Israeli side is they felt it was some security threat from the gathering of people. I think the Palestinians feel that if you're having a religious celebration and especially where they were is an incredibly it's like the third most important holy site in Islam, then and then the Israelis, force you out of your religious celebration. That's a deeply personal and cultural thing that you can then feel that like they obviously don't welcome our beliefs or our religion or our being here, right? So that you know, even if there is some argument of there's too crowded or something, breaking up a religious ceremony is a bag of worms that obviously pisses people off and justifiably. Look at how mad people were when you can't, go to church for months here in America. How many churches protested that, right? Like it's deeply cultural and rooted in people's identity. So to do something like that is obviously going to spark anger. Um, and then yes, there's also that evictions, and the thing is that the evictions of the neighborhoods is a pattern. It's something that you can watch. There's a great Louis Theroux documentary from the BBC. He goes around with a Jewish developer in that area talking about like how he's building all these beautiful suburban homes in like Palestinian land, and he talks about this eviction process, and it doesn't it's dirty, it's complex and it's rough. Like people lose their livelihoods because of Israeli law and preferring Israelis. So that obviously, and so that history of like evicting Palestinians goes on for a long time, and that's because of the Israeli law that after 1947 is allowing Israelis to reclaim land and property lost from the Arab-Israeli War. However, 750,000 Palestinians were also misplaced by those wars, and there's no legal recourse for them to reclaim lands. So that's where that like you can see how even if there's some legitimate claim to this land, multiple people are being treated differently by the government and have different claims to sometimes the same land. It gets very complex. So so I do think that there's things that Israel should have done differently to avoid angering Palestinians, but it's obviously worth saying that Hamas launching rockets at innocent Israelis is not a good response. And the something things like the Iron Dome, the defense that Israel has against Hamas's rockets, should be there. I'm fine with U.S. taxpayer money to build things like the Iron Dome to prevent rockets from harming innocent lives. That's a good thing. What I don't like is then when Israel comes back with airstrikes that hurt innocent lives. It's fighting fire with fire. And when Hamas is based on this narrative that Israel wants to kill every Palestinian, and then Israel does kill Palestinians, Hamas's narrative and recruiting apparatus gets stronger, and the conflict gets deeper entrenched. It's a pattern. It's like neither side wants to de-escalate. Either both sides feel justified in their escalations, and then it leads to just chaos.
Very astute point. Yeah, like it takes two to tango, and I like honestly, if you actually read, not you specifically, but if our listeners actually read into like the day to day life of people, Arab Jews, I mean not Arab Jews, Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, the actual like day to day coercion in society is not that bad. Like there's a lot of like shared, public gatherings. People get along for the most part. For the most part. So I'm sure I'm going to get backlash on that. But the problem is both sides don't, like you said, they just want to escalate. Benjamin Netanyahu, in my opinion, is the worst thing possible for Israel. He is truly becoming slowly an autocratic nationalist who
Yes.
kind of just sees growing is Israel as the only way. Now, a caveat: if you see some of the hate amongst the Arab community towards Israel, you could understand why he's so defense heavy and so like combative against, their surrounding territories. They're in a region of the world where most of their neighbors are not fond of them. Now, obviously that goes back to the historical decision to, annex Israel basically there. But but again, like yeah, like you talked about with these settlements too, it violates international law.
Yes.
And to be super critical of Israel for a moment, the Linkub government, which Netanyahu is, I guess, the leader of, is actively trying to make sure that the two-state solution doesn't happen. They want to keep building these settlements and putting Israeli Jews in there. And so one day, if there were ever talks about actually trying to get a two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian Muslim state and a Jewish Israel state, it would be harder if there's already settlements there. So it's clearly a strategic thing. And I think it was like it was a politician out of East Jerusalem who basically said that. He's like, we are building settlements to make sure that the Palestinians can never have this land. And
Yeah.
that is problematic to me. Like, that is very problematic to me. My issue, though, again, is that Hamas is not a political body. It is a terrorist group that actively uses their own civilians as collateral damage. And then for some reason, and we'll get into this later, Hamas does have sympathy in the media. There is sympathy towards the Palestinian cause without actually talking about what Hamas does. And I remembering like in classes back at Chapman, that always came up is Hamas will use Palestinian Muslims as collateral. They get killed by the Jews, and then it just escalates the situation worse. And I think also the problem is that the Israelis are backed by the West. They're backed by the Americans. So they have better technology. So the problem is that there is a disparity between almost second-class citizens who maybe sometimes start the problem, but Israel's always going to win the fight with big guns.
Yeah, it's asymmetrical, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's great points you made there. Is one is, Hamas might have a political entity, which they do. But they, I think, time and time again have shown to be an Islamist jihadist terrorist group. Um, um, you know, I think there's photos of them in there. A Hamas fighter inside an underground tunnel in Gaza in August 2014 during a tour by Reuters journalists. They stash weapons in civilian areas. So what you're saying is that Hamas understands that the loss of civilian life helps their cause, and can get reported on as Israel killing innocent civilians, which is true, is what happens, and so they're hoping that they put the claim is that Hamas puts weapon stashes and weapon caches and targets that Israel wants to destroy near civilians, so that if Israel wants to destroy them, they have to blow up civilians, and then that in turn betters the narrative for Hamas to recruit and have international support, and things like that. But then you also make a very good point that this war is asymmetrical. It is not two nations of equal economic power and military might fighting it out on a battlefield. It is Israel has the largest recipient of U.S. military aid, and on its own accord has a very substantive and effective military. Known for winning the 7 Days War very quickly against its Arab enemies. Um, so it's a very modern militarized nation that has something like the Iron Dome versus what is essentially an open air prison, which is Palestine, which has economic embargoes, is not recognized by major nations, has kind of been forgotten by its Arab allies. Like that's another thing we mentioned before, which was we talked about when Trump was still president, the deal that they had set out and how Israel was talking more with its Arab buddies, and how Jared Kushner has been kind of maneuvering in between Saudis and Israel for like business deals, right? And so Palestine was getting put to the wayside even as Arab leaders were doing deals with Israel, right? So it's asymmetrical. It's like China versus a Tibet. And not look, that's a terrible example. It's a whole different. But that was a really bad example. It's a whole different political thing. But just in this sense of size and scale of military might versus an economic power, there's a huge difference. So yes, Hamas is a terrorist group that is unfortunately willing to allow its own people and civilians to die for their political gain. But still, Israel is still the one pressing the trigger to shoot that airstrike and kill innocent civilians, and use police and riot force to kill civilians. So much so that um, we've had tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties in the last year, and only 200 to 300 Israeli casualties in the last years in that same time period. So there obviously is a difference in the effectiveness of the combat being thrown out.
Yeah. And yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point there is that I think one of the biggest issues, like going to the kind of Arab side of it and more the Middle Eastern side of it in general, is that the Arab world is super chaotic in terms of like allegiances, religious faith, and they've never been really a unionized force against like something like an Israel invasion. And so like I mean, I think it was in what 1917 or something when there were first talks of partitioning part of that region for Israel, and then obviously it was after World War II and it finally happened. But the Zionist movement was growing for a long time, and
Mm,
Palestine was always there, but Jordan was actually supposed to partition off parts of it for Jordan. Like they were supposed to establish a Jewish state that would have parts called, I think it was the Triangle communities that would fall under Jordanian control. But then after the war of 1948, Israel took them back. No one stuck up because Jordan, to be honest, doesn't really care about Palestine. Egypt definitely doesn't care about Palestine. Egypt, actually, in the long run, has become an ally of Israel. A lot of these things, from the Oslo Accords to the Camp David Accords, Egypt's been kind of the main voice for the Arab world at the table, not Palestine. And so it seems to me that this was done with kind of a Western bias. Israel from day one had the West and kind of the imperial forces at the time on their side.
yes.
And like I'm not saying, because I do believe in a Jewish state needs to exist, and it makes sense in some ways and doesn't in others why it was put there. For obviously religious reasons, it makes sense. And I have always supported the Jewish cause in terms of that, but it just seems like it was very lopsided, and they should have actually agreed on two states back then. Because since then, it's escalated to the point where they're not talking anymore, and it seems like it's just every 4 to 5 to 10 years, there's just this reiteration of violence because the Arab community, like you said, doesn't seem to care about Palestine. And I used to think that the Abraham
Arab
Accords were,
leaders. Arab leaders.
yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry to misquote that. The Abraham Accords, which Jared Kushner kind of spearheaded. What I think was I want to say last summer. I was wrong. I thought it was actually a good step towards communication between Israel and states like Qatar. That did not happen. I would actually think that it was the neglect of Palestine during these agreements that kind of have led to this.
Mm,
Also Trump's foreign policy kind of gave Benjamin Netanyahu the green light to do what he wanted.
yeah.
Obviously, every American president more or less has been buddy buddy with Israel, but Trump didn't seem to care about the international law and the international implications of just these expanding territories. Moving the consulate to Jerusalem was probably the worst thing you could do. And so I was reading something in the New York Times where a lot of like ex diplomats and foreign Obama administration officials, etc., think that it was actually the moving of the embassy mixed with Trump's just kind of blind look at Palestine that didn't help this. And to be honest, Biden doesn't seem to want to be involved in this either. I've seen people call him a white supremacist. That's not true, I don't think. But it is true that he does really want to stay out of this. And I think it makes sense because it's political suicide, whether you side with
Yeah.
kind of the AOC squad group or if you side with the other more pro Israel side, you don't win. So I get it. But I think Biden's going to have to actually take a harder stance. Like even George W. Bush was willing to condemn Israel and some expansion back when he was president. Obama tried, Trump didn't, and I think Biden's going to have to step it up, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is kind of like a presidential dead man zone, like a no man's
Yeah.
land. Like, we had if you look back at like almost every president. I mean, obviously there's no peace in the Middle East, so every president that's tried, and the thing is, a lot of presidents have made it a point of their presidency. Bill Clinton famously is one of them that was trying to make it a point to do peace in the Middle East. Had the Camp David Accords in 2000, or the Camp David Summit, sorry, and it didn't work. Um, um, and we can get into a little bit of why that didn't work. But George Bush, tried to do some talks, didn't work. Obama didn't work. Trump even mentioned in his campaign that he wanted to have peace and peace like never before, like peace you've never seen. It didn't work. And so, strangely, yeah, like you said, as Biden's actually been pretty quiet about it because I think he understands that it's like, Like, why would I make it a staple of my campaign if I just know that it's not gonna like it's just
Mhm.
it's like it's a no man's land. It's a dead zone of political success. So, but now he's thrust into it. This is like the crisis you don't prepare for, right? Like just got COVID under control, and bang, here you go again. Israel and Palestine. Good luck. Um, and I did notice that his rhetoric is pretty tame, like you mentioned. I think he said, because again, like I do believe that Israel has overreacted with their airstrikes hitting Associated Press buildings. We've now had 200 people in Palestine killed. I mean, we don't can hard to confirm those numbers, but that's what we've been hearing, including a dozen plus children. Like Jesus, man. Like obviously, whatever you're doing, like whatever your retaliation should be, because I do agree you have to defend yourself and fight a terrorist group. It should not include a dozen kids getting blown up. Because guess what? That's going to lead to more Hamas fighters. Like that's literally just a bad strategy on top of being a human rights violation and a war crime. So, but that's what's happening. And Joe Biden has mentioned that he thinks that there was not an overreaction by Israel, but he's monitoring the situation and wants to talk to Netanyahu. And you're like, damn, that's pretty tame from someone like you said that even George Bush has condemned Israel. It's pretty tame.
It is, and I just think the Democratic Party, this actually could be a giant schism in it, just between kind of I want to say the younger, more progressive wing
Yeah.
and the older, more establishment side. And it's definitely a discussion that's going to be had, I'm sure. I do see Biden's probably going to have to change his rhetoric eventually because let's be honest, if anyone's going to listen, it's like listen about this crisis, it's going to be it's going to have to be us.
Yeah.
Um, I just think again that like the other side of this problem, and I just really quick wanted to talk about um, Mr. Yasser Arafat, who because I think he's an example of what could happen if there was more discussion, but also how you fail at having a discussion. Because to me, it seems like Palestine is broken. Like Abbas has, like I said earlier, he's in 17 years of his first 4-year term. He's not giving up power. He's super old. I think he's like 90. And
I love the
and
I just love the way you put that. 17 years into his first 4-year term.
it was not me that said that. I forget where I saw it,
It's
but
clever.
but yeah, I mean, like let's be honest, Hamas and Hezbollah are the alternative to the Fatah party, which Abbas I think is the leader of. He's at least the prime minister there. But the problem is that there's like not really much of an alternative, and so
Right.
like it's kind of like what is next. And Yasser Arafat, I actually find fascinating because he was the chairman of the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he was involved for a long time, from '69 to 2004. I think he died in 2004. And he actually was probably the closest in Palestine to getting to some form of negotiations. And there was respect from Clinton and the Israeli side and the Egyptian side, mainly because this guy first identified that Israel exists, but he also actually respected the idea of a diplomatic Palestine. He did condemn a lot of the Hamas fighting going later on, but he was careful not to just condemn it. He wanted to more like muddle the waters and actually challenge people to question, why do you keep doing this? And so he became a symbol of actually like maybe hope. The problem is there's a great article I was reading that talked about how he was so obsessed with being a symbol and part of the negotiations that he was never willing to actually go forward in ending the crisis. And so he would kind of like, give small concessions, which happened with Clinton in the Camp David summit. And also Oslo, is that he would give small things, but it was never something that was seen as long term or lasting. But I think it does give a framework for you don't condemn the anger of Hamas or Hezbollah or these other groups, but you do say that we can't go on by blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
We have to go on by identifying that we're going to have to exist one way or another. Now, again, Israel's gone much more extreme since then, but I think the problem is there's no one like an Arafat who ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize along with the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader at the time. And he at least had an idea, and the problem is Abbas is old and seems to just be kind of an autocrat, and Hamas just hates Israel. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
It
all I
does
got there. But yeah.
it does seem like that Camp David summit was the closest we got,
Mhm.
and it failed, and now they're farther than they were then. I think Arafat even mentioned to Bill Clinton that said, "You're a great man," and Bill Clinton said, "No, I'm not. I would have been, but you ruined it." Like I was I was about to have middle I was about to be the president that brokered Middle East peace, but you weren't serious enough. What's interesting is
Mhm.
What's also interesting about that Camp David summit is how unpopular the concessions were that Israelis gave up in the talks that eventually didn't happen, but how at that time as well that the Israeli side, the government at least, was as willing to give a lot of things up, that the Israeli people were not, just to get on the table, just to bring it to the table, and it still fell through. I mean, the Palestinians on there said they would say that there was issues of sovereignty and security that fell those talks apart, but it does seem like so obviously I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but historically it does seem like U.S. and Israel were more willing to come to an agreement in the 2000 summit specifically at that time than Palestine was. But then now today, neither side is not even close to that point. Like Netanyahu's not that close to that point. Like I don't think a Camp David summit could happen right now at all. And that's sad because it was as close as we think we could have gotten in recent history, and right now we're farther than ever. Even though we had this lull for a bit, for like 4 to 6 years, I think it's now worse than ever. And and yeah, and I wanted to just mention, before again, like, because I don't think we're going to solve this problem tonight,
Mhm.
certainly not. But I do want to mention that the great Atlantic article you had mentioned. This is, keeping everyone's idea of biases and whatever. This is Maddie Friedman, a Canadian Israeli reporter who's for the Atlantic, but at the time he was for the Associated Press, between 2006 and 2011, in the Jerusalem bureau, and how he talked about, you know there was a culture, a perspective and a culture around reporters that was not necessarily objective, that in his mind. Um, and I encourage you to, because I think it's going to be too much and too in the weeds for us to delve into right here all the way. But I really encourage you guys to read this because it's an interesting perspective. But I think there's some really interesting takeaways that's important, and it reminds me a lot of my studies in anthropology, right here, where it's um, so many photographers cover protests in Israel and the Palestinian territories, for example, that one of the challenges for anyone taking pictures is keeping colleagues out of the frame. Like there's so many reporters and photographers, you struggle to keep them out of your frame. That the other photographers are as important to the story as Palestinian protesters or Israeli soldiers. This does not seem to be considered. It's almost like, what role does all these reporters and NGOs and different eyeballs being there have on how people react or portray themselves? It's very similar to in anthropology when studying a culture, outside of a context of like a conflict or a war, just studying a culture. There's this idea that perhaps even just being there as an anthropologist taking notes might change the behavior of the people you're studying, or there's an interesting relationship that's not necessarily bias free, right, that you have to keep in mind. And I think that's super interesting when it comes to Palestine, because of what that is that Hamas understands the media narrative, and if they're willing to portray themselves in a way that can garner international support, and while ignoring their own faults, that's beneficial. The guy in the Atlantic claims that that happens, where Hamas would threaten journalists to write stories, and then they wouldn't report on that.
Yeah, and it actually kind of goes full circle back to kind of our talk about the asymmetrical response and just the asymmetrical carnage. Is if you're a journalist on the ground talking to NGOs that usually are doing a good thing, trying to just bring aid to people in need,
Right.
the Palestinians are being asymmetrically impacted by the violence,
Absolutely.
even if sometimes they've started the violence. And that's the problem is that if you're on the ground just seeing that shit happen day and day night, you're going to be an advocate for human rights. And sometimes that's without looking at the broader picture. Like, like you said, without going too far into the article, because it's definitely a lot. There's a university in 2014 where there was an image of this Islamic Jihad group these students who supported it were basically doing Heil Hitler's, the I don't even know what that's called, the straight arm thing. I don't know. And the article makes clear these are not Nazis, but there's this hate towards Israel that it showed in that photo, but the media didn't cover it. But it also shows why Israelis are so terrified of this image of what their surrounding neighbors think of them. And so it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing at that point to me. But it really does show how I think that even though like the NGOs and humanitarian aid are doing the right thing, journalists need to be removed from that. But like you said, if you're there on the ground, it's really hard to do so. And that's why like over the last week, I've just seen so many social media posts that are just like F Israel or F Palestine. And it's just like this is so much more complicated than that, that like unfortunately, I think it was a lot of mess ups during the Truman years and prior that we should have solved a lot of this a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean that's the absolutely. I mean this conflict goes way deeper than even 2014 or
Hmm.
2000 or before then, right? But um, I just do think it's important to realize, like, just to keep that in mind of that idea of what does so many reporters and journalists being there, being involved in NGOs due to the integrity of journalism. Now, I'm not saying that we should just ignore the reports coming out of Palestine. I'm not saying that at all. I think we should give them more attention. But it is worth knowing that, like, yeah, like Hamas understands what media narrative is. To think that they're not like, think that they're like, think that they're to think that the media's role is completely separated from what's happening, I think is um, naive. I think we now understand that media's role is more than ever tied into political success. That we have to just keep that in mind when looking at coverage of something so sensitive and so politically divisive around the globe.
Absolutely. I totally agree, and yeah, we are not going to solve this here, but I think this was at least, it shows to a lot of people who I think are just seeing the lack of nuance going on that yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done, and I do think that Biden is going to be kind of opening up and seeing the light with some of this, but we shall see. We shall definitely see.